Hey, how's life? This is Sam Harris Reading List, and this particular book is called DMT, The Spirit Molecule, a doctor's revolutionary research into the biology of near-death and spiritual experiences. Ooh, an exciting title. So I actually I really liked this book. I thought it was fascinating, but not for the reasons that I'm sure most people, or a lot of people at least, would find it fascinating. A lot of the more ostentatious aspects of the book I found just ridiculous and annoying and vague and pointless. But a lot of the stuff that had to do with the nuts and bolts of trying to get to be able to test a drug on human beings, that was fascinating. And I can't make too much out of heads or tails out of much of all the technical chemical aspects of what was going on here, because I don't know all that much about this area, so I just had to take the writer's word for it. But the writer is good. A lot of great stuff that the writer brings together and talks about, and so many interesting situations that come up that are discussed in this piece. So I really liked it. So just as a kind of an overview, a summary, taking pieces here and there from what I remember. Early on, it talks about the pineal gland, a big deal, has been for a long time. I'm sure in undergrad, everybody read about who was it? Was it Da Vinci or somebody? Or one of those Greek philosophers? I don't know. But somebody brought up pineal gland and talked all about it like it was the big seed of everything that was spiritual or fascinating or extra about humans. So what is DMT? DMT is a very short-lasting psychedelic. It actually occurs naturally in the brain. DMT itself is usually smoked when it's not coming out of I don't think it's smoked in the brain. I think it's usually smoked when it's out of the brain. There are different methods for you can get. I put IM. I don't even remember what that stands for, but I'm guessing that's just from the outside. And then IV. You can take it IV. You can just have it injected directly into your system. Oh, there we go. So it's intramuscular versus intravenous, and they have different times. From what I remember, there are different times for it to take effect and how long it lasts and that sort of thing. It is considered the spirit molecule, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but it allegedly creates spiritual experiences. And of course, Sam Harris is big on all this sort of stuff. I got his book Waking Up when I went to his talk. I got his book Waking Up, which he signed for me. Thanks, Sam. And I haven't read it yet because I have so much to read, but anybody who knows Sam Harris knows that that's kind of one of the sticking points related to his work in general, because he created his stature. He stood on top of the ideas around skepticism and atheism and being hyper-skeptical of curious claims, especially claims that are incredibly vague and ought to require a tremendous amount of evidence. And yet he was spouting a whole bunch of stuff related to Buddhism and ideas that came out of Buddhist tradition, and lauded the use of psychedelics and the spiritual and psychological and intellectual experiences that you can have while on psychedelics. So now he's more, it's less psychedelics and more meditation and various forms of Buddhism. But still, that's one thing that's about Sam Harris, that he is big on that stuff. And he regularly has people on his podcast that talk about this aspect of spirituality. And I generally find it fascinating, although it certainly veers hard left, hard right into all sorts of vague assertions. And this book is no different, that's for sure. And some of the thoughts on it, yeah, we'll get more into that. But there's one thing, something that comes out of the spiritual experiences when on DMT tends to be something about connectedness, like connectedness to the world, connectedness to other people, etc. And of course, there's a realm of this kind of talk that it's going to flirt with that hippie, oh, we're all one, bro, and that sort of thing. So you wonder how often it skews into that kind of a discussion. But anyway, so this particular author and scientist is talking about how he was trying to get to study the effects of DMT on people and get subjects to be able to test this on. And so I think initially, I'm not sure where in the book, but it goes through this whole lengthy thing about how you have to get this process and how you have to get approval from the government to use this kind of psychedelic, even with consent of people. You think about it, and at least when I think about it, I would just think that, okay, somebody agreed to take something they sign a waiver, and there you go. You can give them whatever you want. But that's certainly not the case. It was a hell of a process, and I think the price of admission was worth just reading about this process, about how you have to go through being an academic, a scientist, trying to get to a point where you can test this drug on willing participants, and being able to find the right participants, and the kind of double-blind study, and how you're going to study it, how you're going to know that the effects work, how you're going to function with the placebos, how you're going to keep people's identities confidential, and there was just this whole thing about maintaining confidentiality that was fascinating by itself. But so there's this whole process that's talked about. I've got a couple of notes here about melatonin and light, and I can't remember what I was trying to get at with having written these notes, so I will move on. Apparently, it takes 49 days to develop the pineal gland, and that's how long it takes to develop a gender. Just a little tidbit. They're not sure why. DMT is released during sex. I don't know if I've had any psychedelic experiences during sex. I mean, I've been relatively close, but it hasn't. Oh, I think there's something that they talk about later that endogenous DMT hasn't been linked to. Oh, it's my research afterwards that I found that endogenous DMT doesn't have a clear correlation with psychedelic experience. I don't know. It's just the way you get it, I guess. And then he talks about specific case studies. There was Marcia, who was overweight, and she was very insecure about being overweight, and was married, and she had this vision about her being on a carousel, and there was something, I think there were a bunch of men around the carousel, and they found her attractive or something like that. I don't know, but it was an experience, a psychedelic experience that she had that seemed to comment in some way on her present psychological issues and the things that she had with her husband, and she was challenging her husband in the meeting, and her husband seemed like a wuss. So it had very clear import for purposes of her psychology, these visions that she was having. And of course, this is one thing that I'm going to get into, is that this is all self-reported. This is what I saw, and who knows how accurate any of it is, or whether somebody's rewriting their experience, their psychedelics, or whatever, to put it into a narrative that makes sense, that fits their psychology. And who knows how much this writer in particular is editing what they had to say about it to make it more of a clear narrative, more of an impactful narrative. Who knows? But I like, no matter the case, I definitely like this writer, and I definitely like this book. It was fascinating. It was so much fun to read. Then there's Cassandra, who was androgynous, had these visions of clowns. She was terrified of clowns. I believe she was terrified of clowns. I don't have other notes, but she had these visions of clowns. And there was something that was especially significant that meant something to her from a rose in a Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem. And I know I wrote the poem down somewhere, but it's just a rose from that poem that she had read at some point, and it had a special significance related to her psychology and her psychedelic experiences. Then there are other ones, there's a section about aliens and people's experience with aliens while on the psychedelics and near-death experiences. There's another guy, Carlos, who had a religious trip and met a shaman, or became a shaman, or shaman. I think I like shaman, that pronunciation better, but whatever the case. Carlos had a more distinctly religious trip when he was doing it. And I know, there were different people came to the study from different perspectives, although most of them, I think, had some kind of experience with psychedelics. So they actively had an interest in this area already. And it turned out, as we go along, we hear about their experiences, and some of them will have revelations, like they need to be more thoughtful or less hostile or love their fellow Homo sapien, whatever else. But one thing that the researcher found was that the DMT psychedelic experiences, or spiritual experiences, whatever you want to call them, they rarely had long-term effects. They were usually very short-lived effects, at least in a grander scale. After a few months, the people would generally not be as committed to these ideas that they had in their revelatory spiritual experiences. They wouldn't be as committed, and they'd let them fall kind of by the wayside, and even talk about them in terms of not having much interest in these experiences, the spiritual experiences. And then, here we're at the end, and it goes off the kind of deep end, and it talks about these being pathways to other dimensions, these experiences, and that part of your brain that processes this DMT and creates these psychedelic experiences are some kind of a pathway to other dimensions, and that people would become a transmitter for signals that are coming from other dimensions, or other beings, or aliens, or whatever else. And from what I could tell, these last chapters were very serious. They were genuinely taking these questions seriously. And that would be perfectly fine if it wasn't so incredibly vague. It would just say things like, oh, we're a transmitter. Meaning what? We're a transmitter for what, from what, getting the signal how, for what purpose, what does it have to do with anything? And it just seemed like the vague ramblings of somebody trying to place their work or their ideas into a grander context rather than just a flickering of something inside somebody's brain that doesn't have any more significance. It's like inducing a dream, something like that you can't put in a box because you were conscious at the time. Who knows? But it's just heaping on all this significance without justification from what I can see. But you have to justify, I guess, the subtitle. So there you go. So some of my thoughts on the book. Like I said, thoroughly enjoyable to read. All of these things were self-reported experiences, and I have incredible suspicion humans self-reporting the results of something. I'm very skeptical of this. I think their brains work at twice the speed to try to create some kind of a narrative out of whatever was happening to them. They'll omit things that don't fit a narrative. They'll embellish things that do. So who knows what actual significance this has for trying to determine what DMT does and how the brain functions when it's under DMT or when it's not under DMT. And the people that would end up doing the test, of course, were people who had an interest in this, had an interest in psychedelic experiences or spiritual experiences. They were ones who were drawn to this idea in the first place, so that's going to skew. And of course, it'd be very difficult to just get people against their will to come and try it. I wouldn't be inclined to try these sorts of things, but I might be a better base to be able to develop some kind of a medical understanding from. So like I said earlier, the procedures for getting approval for all these tests was a fascinating bit of this book that I loved reading. There was one story where one of the patients had a freak out when they took it during one of the sessions, and they fled. They got out of the building and out into the streets and eventually got picked up by their husband. But they were out in the world on DMT as when they were part of the study. They just took off. They freaked out and took off. And what a crazy situation to have to deal with. But it was fascinating. Then there was another where one of their interns or employees actually started doing drugs with one of the patients that they were having regular sessions with, and then became combative when they were told that they couldn't do that anymore, and then showed up one day at the researcher's house and was like, I need to do these drugs, let's do the drugs together, come on, and really pressing it and then breaking down in tears, all kinds of crazy stuff. What kinds of people are attracted to this stuff? Of course, the researcher and Sam Harris, the two people that I really know who have done these things, are perfectly sane as far as I can tell and don't have any of these kinds of tendencies. So I'm sure the vast majority of people who use DMT or other sorts of drugs are perfectly fine. So some of my post-reading research, like I said, there's no data connecting endogenous DMT to altered consciousness, altered states of consciousness, as far as I could find. Obviously, I'm not a PhD in this area. I don't know virtually anything about any of this. That's just what I read. So, of course, I'm not going to go through a full labbing it, but just take all of this skeptically. I mean, I reported what I thought of the book pretty accurately, I believe, but take the other stuff skeptically and look for yourself. They found DMT in the pineal gland, so I think this was one of the hypotheses of the researcher, and I think this was confirmed. I think the researcher also developed a hallucinogen rating scale after this book, and went from melatonin to DMT, then to psilocybin, and I think it was in the midst of the psilocybin test that he had to shutter the whole thing because there were all sorts of issues coming up. And when I tried to search for articles about this book, just reviews or discussions about this book, I kept getting, the first one I ran into was the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and then Psychedelic Press UK, and Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. I was hoping for some more mainstream treatments of the book, but I couldn't find much of anything. And the book talked about a couple of cases that I remember. I read O Centro in school. It was about ayahuasca, whatever, and whether the religious right to be able to use this in ceremonies trumped the right of the state to circumscribe use of it, to make it illegal and prosecute anybody who used it. And I remember in that one, the religious right won out. There wasn't a sufficient government interest, and I can't remember. They would have applied rational basis, right? So there's no rational basis to be able to prevent this? I can't remember. I remember there's something pretty distinctive in that case. I think it was O Central, but anyway, whatever. I believe that the religious right to use this illegal drug overcame the state's right to be able to prosecute based on their laws. So, and there was another one that was mentioned, the Church of Holy Light of the Queen v. Mukasey, and that's ayahuasca tea, and it barred the government from prohibiting or penalizing the use of the tea for religious purposes, and there was a list of regulations set out. I think this is what my notes mean, that the judge listed out regulations, which doesn't make any sense. A judge doesn't get to do that. This is like what happened with Roe v. Wade, or earlier ones. Was it Roe v. It might have been Planned Parenthood, but one of those cases related to abortion. A judge explicitly listed out, this is what you can do as a legislator. That these are the things that are acceptable. Judges don't get to do that. So it's a curious situation. I personally don't have any interest in seeing Roe v. Wade overturned on that or any basis, just because I want fewer people. But and I want crime rates to stay low. But it's still a strange thing. Judges don't get to do that. They don't get to legislate from the bench like that. So, but in this case, it was saying that the government doesn't get to prohibit somebody using the tea, the ayahuasca tea, for religious purposes. And I love this idea of religious purposes. Like, you just know that some people are genuine, some people are not, and there's some kind of a threshold for a religious interest, that some ridiculous ceremony that's going to make luck in the future or some nonsense. And you just have to respect it because it's religious. Whatever. But anyway, whatever the case, the book is great. I would recommend reading it. It's not particularly long from what I remember, but it's got some really good stuff. If you have any interest in this area, just how the brain works in general, I kind of wish a psychologist would have been on hand to really be able to analyze. And I don't remember, maybe the writer of this was a credentialed psychologist. I don't know. It would have been nice to go through the people's experiences and have some kind of a method, some kind of an ability to be able to evaluate them and determine psychologically what they mean. Every book can't do everything. So whatever the case, I definitely think it was worth reading, and I appreciate it being on the list. So I guess I will see you guys in the next one.